Hey, it's Jacob, welcome to my channel. Today I want to make a quick tutorial for beginners about Python modules. By the end of this video, you'll be able to get started with Python without making the basic errors most beginners make with modules. More specifically, I'll talk about what a module is, non-standard modules, the dry principle, importing modules, and the broken windows principle. So let's get started. So what is a module? Well, one way to think of it is Python can't do everything easily. For example, if you want to control a software like Excel from Python, then Python can do that easily. And when you think about it, it makes sense because if you have a new software that just came out and it has weird functionalities or weird features, then that would be weird that Python anticipated for those features. So a module is something external to Python that you can import in your script so that it'll make it easier for us to use that software. So let's take a real world example and say you are doing data entry with Excel day in and day out. Well, then that'd be a good idea to let Python do that for you. Well, you need to download and import the module that will do that for you. Now, here is the tricky part. Data entry is a large topic, and there are a lot of ways to do it. For example, depending on the level of sophistication, maybe you want to do graphs, maybe you don't. So if the level of sophistication of that module is not adapted to what you want to do, one of two things can happen. Either the module is going to be too simplistic, in which case you're not going to be able to do what you want to do, or you're going to add a layer of complexity that is unnecessary. So what's the point? The point is there are several modules to do data entry with Excel. And it's the same thing for Word, PDFs, Outlook, or PowerPoint. So to recap, modules are a way to make it easier and faster to do something specific. But if you're coding, you'll definitely do some things more than others. For example, if you're dealing with Excel files, then it's very different from using Python to build websites. So if you're doing the same things again and again, then that means by definition you are doing something more specific than what Python was built for, since it's a very general language. So what does that mean? Well, that means in a way you are doing something specific, which means you can create your own module to make it easier to do those things you do again and again. So now that you know what modules are, before you start using them, I'm going to tell you what not to do, because there is nothing more demotivating than starting off on the wrong foot when it comes to programming. And the first mistake beginners make is not using the right module. I already talked about levels of sophistication for different modules, but here I want to talk about standard and non-standard modules. Beginners don't know what the standard modules are, and what ends up happening is they'll use a module that is way too specific when a general module can work. They'll have tons of modules in their script and get lost. As a general principle, it's a bad thing to have useless lines of code, but I will come back to that later. But the main problem here is if you use non-standard modules, unless you know what you're doing, you'll probably have to look for information on how to use it. Now, here's what you need to know. Non-standard modules are not well documented. You won't find what you're looking for with a quick online search. To me, that's the main reason that disqualifies non-standard modules. Plus, there might be compatibility issues with Python versions, future ones or previous ones. In other words, it makes everything more difficult, and especially when you're a beginner, you really don't want to make things more difficult than they need to be. Now let's move on to the second mistake beginners make, not having one way of importing a module. For this one, I'm going to give you a real-world example. Here's what I found in the same script. Here, we have 4 different ways of importing a module. The first way is importing specific functions from that module. The second way is importing the module. The third way is importing the module and renaming it. And the fourth one is importing every functions in that module. Now, if you have no idea what all of that means, the point is you don't need to know. If you're a beginner, all you need to know is one way of doing it and sticking to that. You can come back to it later if you're interested in knowing more about how to do that in different ways, but the point is, don't do that before your project is done. If you start learning about all the ways of doing everything you're doing, then you're going to start thinking that programming takes time. The reality is, it doesn't have to, and it's counterproductive. Why? Because if you have different ways of using a module, then you'll have different ways of using the functions inside that module. So it'll make the code 10 times more difficult to read and 10 times easier to get lost even when you're experienced. And even if you don't get lost, it won't be an enjoyable experience to work on your code and debug it. And now the third mistake, which is importing the same module more than once, is also contained in that piece of code. If we make sure to not make the second mistake by having one way of importing a module, then it'll prevent us from importing the same module more than once. So let's come back to the example so that you see what I mean. Here, we import the module called tkinter. Here, we import that module again, and we rename it as tk. So we are doing the exact same thing twice. And this probably wouldn't have happened if we had only one way of importing a module. Now, in programming, not doing things twice is called the dry principle. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself. The problem when you don't respect the dry principle is that you have more lines than you should in your script. One of the best practices of programming is having less lines of code in your file than the size of your screen. So the first thing is removing the lines of code that are useless makes it easier to reach that target. And the second thing is another principle of programming is the principle of broken windows. Basically, when you have a house with broken windows, you're going to stop caring about the rest of the house. And gradually the house will get worse and worse. And the idea is it's the same thing for your code. If you leave things you don't need in your code, then you don't respect that principle and things will get worse and worse. So for example, building on it and fixing the issues will become increasingly more painful as time goes by, and the probability of giving up on whatever the thing is you want to do is going to start growing dangerously high. So these things are not theoretical or academical, because in theory it doesn't matter. If we were robots and didn't feel the pain of having to read tons of lines of code, then it wouldn't matter. But in practice, this is likely to make the difference between a finished project and one you ended up giving up on. So now you know everything you need to know to get started without making the most costing errors beginners make when using modules. Now if you do want to get started with Python, you can do it by yourself, but you might find a lot of content that is not adapted to your level, which could lead you astray. So it might take a lot of time and trial and error. That's the reason why I created a free online course to help you avoid wasting your time and cut down your learning curve drastically if you're a total beginner. You can click on the link in the description to get it. Have a great day and see you in the next video.